Okay, hi, good afternoon. And for this tutorial, we're going to talk about some text critical features of a text that we're transcribing, and we're going to show how we mark up some of these features in TEI XML. So I've chosen this text, which is a gravestone, 18th century gravestone, and as you'll see when we look a little bit closer at the text, I just wanted to have the image of the whole thing up because it's quite a fun stone with various different iconographic features on it, including this memento mori skull up the top, these labels up here and here. But when we zoom in a little more on the text, you see there are various interesting features in the text itself, such as a lot of abbreviations and some slightly archaic spellings, and some features that are also potentially ambiguous in terms of how we interpret them, and we'll come to those as I go through. So I transcribed this earlier, and so this I will just copy and paste this text, which is my transcription of the stone, and I will open this in Oxygen, and you've now seen what a TEI file looks like, so we don't need to go into that too much detail. So I'm just going to put the text directly here in a paragraph element, and then we can start editing it in here. So I'm going to do a couple of things before we start. One is I'm going to say that the words memento mori and the words fugit hora are two separate paragraphs to the main text. We could have more elegant ways of encoding that, but let's not worry about that for the moment. And the second thing I'm going to do, just to get it out of the way, is I'm going to tag each the beginning of each new line with an LB tag. In the wrong place. Just to the wrong place as well. Just to get that marked up. So there are a few things that we might want to say about this text. I will bring up the photograph again just to as a start. The first is that quite a lot of the characters in this text are superscripted. They're written above the line and in smaller text than the main feature. So for example, the E here is actually written above the Y. I'm not, for the purposes of this, going to differentiate between letters that are written above the line and letters which are written above another letter, but you might want to say there's a difference between stacked letters and letters that are just raised above the line. As far as I'm concerned, they're the same thing, but not everyone will agree. So this letter is written above another line. It's not, however, an abbreviation. It is just the word the written with a Y instead of a TH. But so I'm just going to tag that, I guess, as high, to say that those letters are highlighted, and the rend of that is superscript, and nothing much more than that. Mrs. is maybe slightly more complicated. Is Mrs. okay? Here's a question, Christopher. Is Mrs. an abbreviation? And what is it short for? Mistress? I
don't know. You got me.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. That's why we normally don't expand it. Mr. is quite straightforward because you know how to spell Mr., but Mrs. is no longer spelled. So, and what that would have been in the 18th century, I don't know. I don't know the answer to either. So, so for now, let's just assume that Mrs. is not an abbreviation. I'm just going to tag that as high, and again, rend equals superscript. We can come back to that and discuss that later if we want to. So I'm then going to say that Mrs. Sybil Wigglesworth Last is her name, or let's say, yeah, that Sybil name, Wigglesworth is a name, and Last is a name. We already know how to mark up ye because we've got that further up. So we can mark that up 3 times. We then have here nd is again a highlighted, because that's also in superscript. Rend equals superscript. But what we have here is therefore a missing letter. We have an abbreviation where we would say that there's an expanded letter in here, and there would be another E, right? It would be reverend with another E in it. That's why I didn't uppercase, just to make it clearer what's going on. We can then say, Mr. Michael Wiggleworth is another name. Late of Malden Drive, I'm going to say, is his address. CST is okay. So address isn't an element that we can use in transcription. So we'll leave that. So this is again highlighted and superscript. I don't quite know why. So I'm going to say cert is low, because my transcription of that, I just don't know what's going on. Actually, no, cert is low is wrong, right? Chris, I can see Christopher frowning at me. What I want to say there is probably that this is what, unclear. I don't know why there's a CST there. Who departed this life on the 6th? Is 6th written out in the image? Let's have a look. Yeah, 6th is written out. 6th day of August. So again, ST is superscript. And there's an expanded U in there, August. 1708 is a date. 54th, the TH is superscripted, if I remember correctly. Probably too many shortcuts. I'll stop. Rend equals superscript year for age. So I think we've got all the superscripts in there. Let's say that I've tagged this RS as a shorthand for address, which I'm going to use to index street names in various places. I then, so this was my initial transcription. I guess we could also regularize a couple of spellings. So lies, we could say here, that is the original spelling on the stone. So we say this is original. However, we might want to normalize that. So we have two alternative transcriptions of the same word, not because we don't know what it says. We know perfectly well what it says, and we know perfectly well what it means. But we want to record the original form and a regularized form side by side. So I'm going to use a choice element around that org, and then I'm going to put next to it a reg element which says lies, which is the more normal 21st century spelling of that name. And there's a few other words in there we might want to do the same thing to. Reverend, we might also want to say choice and org, and then after we'll put in a reg, and we'll say the normal spelling is reverend, etc. And so there may be a few other things in there that we would want to normalize that I've missed, but that gives us a start. I guess the R of Mr. is also superscripted, and I'll mark that up just because yes, I'm correct. Just because it's that's a case where we can expand the abbreviation. So I'm going to say Mr. is spelled like that. So this has already got a bit messy on the screen, as you can see, but you can see we're marking up various features. So very little of that is text critical features. The regularized spellings are. The text critical features come into this when, having produced this first transcript, which I produced just looking at the stone, I then found a site that had transcribed this, and they had interpreted two of the words that I've interpreted in here differently to what I did. And for the record, I believe they were right in both cases. I'm not a scholar of 18th century English gravestones, and my interpretation was completely amateur. But for the sake of argument, I'm going to say these are two alternative editorial opinions about this this piece of text, and that they were published at different times, they were recorded by different people, and therefore I'm not going to say that one of them is right and one of them is wrong. I'm just going to say that there are these two opinions. The first of them was that I with a very 21st century mentality, interpreted this as being the body of Mrs. Sybil Wigglesworth Last, the wife of Reverend Last, Reverend Michael Wigglesworth. Whereas in the 18th century, it's unlikely that a woman would have kept her surname and joined it with her husband's surname in the way that that implies. And what in fact this is saying is that this is the body of Mrs. Sybil Wigglesworth, the last wife of Reverend Michael Wigglesworth. So my reading that as a name is the interpretation of one scholar, incorrect, but let's not worry about that for the purposes of this demonstration. And the other interpretation is reading it in a different way. So I'm going to use a feature that's it's called apparatus, because you might want to say in one reading, in one publication, in my edition, there's this reading, and then in an apparatus you'll say an earlier editor read this in a different way, or a different witness read this in a different, gives this in a different way. And so I'm going to mark that as a reading. So that last transcribed as a name is one reading. RDG means that's a reading. And there's another reading, which in this case I'm going to put first, just for the sake of argument. And I need to get out of the habit of typing the angle brackets first. The other reading is that last is just a word, not a name, and so we could tag it explicitly as a word if we wanted to, or we could just leave it like that. Okay, and if I was transcribing in a more normalized transcription, I would transcribe that as last and this one as last, because the foolish editor who thought it was a surname would capitalize it, and the other one wouldn't. Right. So that was quite easy. That's just a case of this editor not being a very good editor. The other example is this here, where on the stone, which we interpreted as the man's address, Malden Drive, and then somewhere in between this line and the line above, there was this CST in there, which was difficult to interpret in those circumstances. The more professional transcription that I found clearly showed that question mark was just my notes to myself there. I'll delete that. I'd misread that R, and that's not Malden Drive at all. That was an E, and what it actually said, Mr. Wigglesworth, late of Malden, deceased. So I again need to put in an apparatus feature with this as one of the readings. I will put before it the other reading, which says Malden, it's just a separate word, and then in here we have the E, and then it's the superscript part. The superscript part is the same, it's just no longer highlighted. I'll just copy and paste that to save time, and I will delete the unclear. So deceased. How do you spell deceased with an ST? I guess there's an EA in the middle. Deceased. And again, we might want to put a regularization in there, which would then be nested inside this reading, which makes it very, very ugly. And I'm not sure I want to do that, but I suppose I should, just to. So we have a choice. We have a ORIG reading is deceased and the reg reading is deceased. So those are the two editorial corrections. That is to say, correction of an editor by an editor, as opposed to these are textual regularizations of the text by the editor.
Not always elegant, but valid.
Right. So one other thing I want to do is in my notes to myself, I left parentheses around the met in Memento Mori, both instances of met and Memento Mori, and I'll show you the reason I did that. If we zoom in on that, it says Memento Mori there. You see that the vertical stroke, the third vertical stroke of the M and the vertical stroke of the E are a single stroke of this. That's in my discipline that's called a ligature. It probably is in all disciplines, and so I wanted to indicate that somehow. So that's what I put those parentheses in there to remind me to do. But what I will do in there, I can't think of any other way of indicating a ligature than just saying that those letters they're not highlighted, but they're written in a different way from the rest of the text, and that the way that is rendered is with a ligature, and that happens twice. And ligature. I think that's, I guess I could do a couple of other things. I could say that this paragraph is written in Latin, whereas this paragraph, as is the other one, whereas this paragraph is written in English, etc. But that's getting a bit away from technical features. I'll stop there because I want to ask Christopher, firstly, if there's anything else you would mark up in there, and secondly, if there's anything you would mark up differently to how I marked it up.
Well, one simple question regarding structure is, could you explain why and when you might use a div to provide additional structural dimensions to this? Because you just have a body and then a bunch of p tags.
And then three paragraphs. Yes, I didn't want to talk about the div structure of this too much because we have another video on that where we've already talked a bit about divs and paragraphs and things. But I think all I'd say there is that yes, I probably would in fact use a div around these two to say that they're in a different place, that they have a different category. So I'd probably say something like div type is label or caption, maybe. It's a caption to the image. This is another div, which is also a caption, and the rest of this is in another div whose type is something like DAF or whatever. And one could, in theory, point to a facsimile from those divs to say what part of the image they represent. But in practice, I would seldom do that. I would just describe in the description. I'd say the two captions are above and to either side of the main text, flanking the image of the skull at the top of the stone. But yes, one could do much more with that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean the issue with divs too is that some people put text critical information in separate divs also. So
Right.
In this case, the text critical information is within the transcription itself. Could you just talk for a moment about the differences between the apparatus and the choice elements? Because some editors would see the choice element as an apparatus type thing.
Yes.
Regularizations can be emendations, in other words.
Yes.
Right? Versus unclear, where you're signaling lack of clarity.
Yeah. No, I think the distinction in TEI terms is fairly straightforward. It's that app is used to nest multiple readings or comments on those readings. That is to say, where potentially editors disagree with each other, or one editor is expressing that there are two possible ways of doing it, but more specifically, if either two editors disagree with one another, or two different manuscripts offer different readings, two different witnesses offer different readings to a text. Whereas choice is giving a single interpretation of the text, but is simply representing that interpretation in multiple ways. So in this case, org and reg, we're saying this is actually what's on the page, what's on the stone, and this is a more normal way of writing it. Other ways of saying would be sic and cor, would be another pair that can go inside choice, and that would be saying this is what is actually on the stone, but it is an error, and what the scribe would have written if they'd stopped and thought about it would be the following. And the other thing you can have inside choice, the other pair you can have inside choice is abbreviation and expansion. So different from the expanded characters that I've put in this text, you could say this is the abbreviation and this is the expansion, which is in many ways quite similar to org and reg in its semantics. So the distinction in markup terms between the choice element and its nested elements, and the app element and its nested elements, is fairly clear. I think it's unambiguous. Whether I've made it clear or not is another question. But in terms of how an editor thinks about it, there's obviously a lot of overlap between the two. I think there's no an editor would, as long as I had correctly and clearly explained that distinction, an editor would have no problem choosing which one to do, but they would say, I don't really see there's any distinction between the two. They're both things that I would want to put in my apparatus criticus. They're both things which are text critical interpretive interventions. And that's true. There's just two different elements for encoding those two different things. And sometimes the distinctions in TEI are more arbitrary than we might want them to be. But that's okay. We have one element. We have two different elements, one of which groups together three different kinds of intervention, and the second one has the fourth type of intervention. We just have to live with the fact that there's two different elements. It's not.
Another way of thinking of it, I think, is that with apparatus elements, you're often dealing with variants, substantive variants of words, whereas with choice elements, you're really just dealing with the same word spelled differently. But I think what's interesting is that it really depends on the material you're working with. There will be cases where the lines are a bit blurry. And it also depends on what your editorial principles are. If you're doing a student edition of a text, for example, you're probably going to be using a lot of choice elements and not much app. But, as you just showed with the epigraphic text, you might have a lot of apparatus entries and a lot of choice elements because it's diplomatic and it's representing this real thing that has lots of oddities. The point is to be consistent, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if consistency matters because this is going to be processed as part of a corpus, yes. Otherwise, the point is to be expressive. But so the other thing that I would say, if Christopher had just marked this up in this way and asked me, Gabby, is there anything here you do differently? I'd have replied, yes, I would do abbreviations differently, because I don't in my own usage of TEI, because I use Epidoc, which is a particular flavor of TEI. I don't mark up abbreviations the way that we've marked them up in this example. I mark them up in different ways. And if you're interested in knowing more, in the second half of the week, there's stuff on how we encode abbreviations in Epidoc. There's also a slight difference in the way we use unclear. I think Christopher might use unclear slightly differently than I have here, and I certainly would use unclear differently than I have here if I was doing this in Epidoc. The point of which is that there are potentially different ways of using the TEI to do your text, and that depends on your editorial principles, on the goals of your edition, and on the community and the conventions in which you're working. For the purposes of this exercise, you can more or less sort of make it up and do whatever seems to make sense, follow the guidelines and so forth. But when working in a specific project in a specific community, you will want to make concrete decisions about which type of markup you want to use.
Indeed.
Okay, I think we're done. Great. Thanks a lot.